Hello, this is the Cottage Sampler Quilt. It's such a fun and versatile pattern. It has 11 different blocks, and I'm going to walk you through all of them and how to put them together. So stay tuned for the Cottage Sampler Quilt tutorial. Here are all my pieces cut from the 4 fabrics I'll be using. We're going to start block 1 with 4 at a time flying geese. Draw a line diagonally on each of the 4 small blocks. Then take 2 of those small squares and line them up with the corners of the large square, right sides together. Sew on each side of the line and cut on the line. I'm going to press the seam allowance towards those small triangles. Now take the extra 2 small squares and line them up with the corners of the pieces we just made. We're going to sew again on each side of the marked line and cut on the line, and press again towards the small triangles. Now it's time to trim. We're going to make sure we trim and keep that point of the large triangle a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the flying geese block. And we're going to make sure that we keep that point centered on the block as well. We're going to make a total of 8 of these flying geese block A. Then we're going to repeat the process and on our flying geese block B. The only difference is the colors. On flying geese B, the large square is fabric 4 and the small squares are fabric 1. Now we have 8 flying geese A and 8 flying geese B, and we're going to sew them together with B on top and A on the bottom. So we'll end up with 8 sets. Then we'll press our seam allowance towards flying geese B. And these are the side blocks of our block 1. Now we're going to move to the center block. We're going to be making 8 at a time HSTs. We start with a square of fabric 2 and fabric 3. We'll draw 2 lines, corner to corner, diagonally. And we're going to sew on each side of both lines and then cut on both lines. Then we're going to cut each of the resulting triangles in half through the center. Then we'll press open the HSTs, pressing the seam allowance open. Then we'll trim. We're going to use 4 of our 8 HSTs to make the center block. We'll save the other 4 to make our corner blocks in the next step. So we're going to arrange our blocks in a square like this. Since I'm making the throw and it requires 2 block 1s, I'm making 2 center blocks. Then we'll move on to the corner blocks. We're going to use the 4 reserved HSTs from the center blocks, and we're going to make 8 more HSTs using the 8 at a time method. Using these 12 HSTs and 4 fabric 1 squares, we're going to make 4 corner blocks. Each block will have 3 HSTs and 1 fabric 1 square. Now we have our center block, 4 side blocks, and 4 corner blocks, and we can assemble our block 1. We're going to assemble it 1 row at a time, and then we'll sew the rows together, pinning at the seams. For the throw, we need 2 block 1s. This is a 24-inch block. Now we're ready to move on to block 2. We're going to make 2 at a time HSTs. We're making 1 set with fabrics 1 and 3 and 1 set with fabrics 2 and 3. We'll draw a line diagonally corner to corner and then sew on each side of that line. Then cut on the line. We're going to press the seam allowance toward fabric 3. Then we're going to line up a fabric 2 and 3 HST with a fabric 1 and 3 HST, making sure that the fabric 3 triangles are alternating. We're going to draw a line from corner to corner and sew on each side of the marked line, and then cut on the marked line. Then we're going to press the seam allowances open. And now we have our hourglass block all ready to trim. Now we'll put our block 2 together using the hourglass blocks on the sides, the fabric 2 squares in the corner, and the fabric 4 square in the center. Block 3 is made exactly like Block 2, except everything's just a little bit smaller. The finished dimensions are 18 inches. And we'll make 2 Block 3s. Block 4 is another Ohio Star block, just like Blocks 2 and 3. It's going to be smaller still. This one measures 12.5 inches. And both halves of the Hourglass block are made from fabrics 1 and 3. We need 2 Block 4s. And Block 5 is just like Block 4, except it's smaller still. It measures 6.5 inches square, and we need 6 Block 5s. Now we're going to move on to Block 6, something different, the Lemoyne Star block. There are 2 different ways to cut the diamonds that we need for this block. The first way is with a ruler with a 45-degree line. We're going to line up the 45-degree line with the bottom of the fabric strip and cut. We're going to measure the distance with the ruler. The other way we could do it is using an acrylic template that you can buy on ShadowValleyQuilts.com. You don't have to measure, you use the template to measure the length and the angle of the diamond. So you can use the ruler, line up the 45-degree line with the base of the fabric strip and measure the correct length and then cut the diamond. I like to cut the tips of the diamond off to reduce bulk in sewing them together. Or you can use the template. We're going to need diamonds in fabrics 1 and fabric 4. Once the diamonds are cut, we're going to cut our triangles. So we have large and small squares. We're going to cut all those squares in half diagonally to make our right triangles. Now we're ready to sew. We're going to start with one color of diamond. We're going to start with fabric 4, and we're going to use the small triangle. We're going to attach the long side of the triangle to the diamond. And we're going to press. Every time we press, we're going to press the seam flat to set it, and then we're going to press the seam allowance open. Now we're going to use the large triangle, and we're going to sew it onto the side of the diamond. This will form a triangle shape. And again, we're going to press the seams. Now we're going to use our fabric 1 diamonds. This time we're going to sew to the opposite side of the diamond. So we're forming a triangle that is oriented in the opposite direction. So now we have 2 triangles that are opposite, and we're going to sew those together. Carefully match the seam and pin the seam in the middle. And we have a square. So for each star block, we're going to have 4 squares. These are the 4 quarters of the block. So carefully sew along the long side of those triangles, matching the seam until you have 4 squares done. Then we're going to trim each square to 6.5 inches. This is a 12.5 inch block, so each quarter is going to be 6.5 inches. We're going to trim it carefully. Then we're going to just sew these 4 blocks together. We're going to carefully match each seam and then press the seam allowances open until we have 2 rectangles that we're then going to sew together. We're going to carefully pin and match each seam again and sew it together. And once we have it pressed, here's our block 6. Block 7 is exactly the same, but smaller. This is a 6.5 inch block. And we're going to do it exactly the same way, just with different colors and smaller sizes. We need 2 block 6 and 6 block 7s. Blocks 8 and 9 are the same, just different sizes. We only need block 9 for the throw size. We're going to start by making the corner blocks out of HSTs. We're going to use the 2 at a time method using fabrics 1 and 3. Once we have the corner blocks made, the rest of the block is just the same as our Ohio Star blocks in blocks 2 through 5. So we're going to make hourglass blocks for the sides, and then we're going to use a fabric 4 square for the middle. And we're going to use our HSTs for the corner blocks. We need 3 block 9s for our throw. Now we're moving on to block 10. We're starting with 2 strips of fabric 4, 1 strip of fabric 2. We'll pin and sew them together, straighten up the end, and cut 6 4.5-inch sections. Now we're going to take 2 fabric 2 strips, 1 fabric 3 strip, and sew them together and cut it into 3 4.5-inch sections. We'll sew these sections together to form 3 of the block 10 blocks. Block 11 is similar. It's made with 2.5 by 5-inch rectangles and 2.5-inch squares. We'll need 2 of block 11. Next, we'll assemble our quilts. We'll take all of the 1.5 by width of fabric sashing and border strips and sew them together end to end and press the seam allowances open. Then we'll cut them to the lengths asked for in the pattern. Now we're going to follow the directions in the pattern and sew all the pieces together. We're going to press the seam allowances open except when the sashing is and the borders are sewn on. Then we'll press the seam allowances towards that border. When I have a longer piece of the sashing or the border to sew on, I like to pin it first before sewing just to avoid any stretching or buckling effect. The pattern goes together in 3 sections, and then we sew the 3 sections together for a finished quilt top. And here's our lovely finished quilt. Thanks for joining me for the Cottage Sampler Quilt tutorial. If you'd like to make your own, you can get the pattern on shadowvalleyquilts.com. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.